Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Well, many thanks for joining us today on the Journal of Biophilic Design. We're really thrilled to be joined by Melissa Marselle, lecturer in environmental psychology at the University of Surrey. Her research focuses on the health benefits of nature and biodiversity, as well as the psychology of sustainability. We're going to touch on various things like fractals and nature views and why biodiversity is important in all of this. In fact, why biodiversity is a crucial element. I'm hoping to get her back on the show to talk about urban street tree biodiversity and also antidepressant prescriptions, which are all linked to nature. But we're also going to talk today about her biodiversity health framework model, which she published earlier this year. So I'm really, really thrilled to be joined by you, Melissa. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks for the opportunity.
Lovely. Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do and what got you into it, please?
Yeah. So I'm an environmental psychologist. And so for a lot of people that is maybe new, maybe you think that I talk to trees about their mothers or things like this. But an environmental psychologist studies the relationship between people and their environment. So generally, psychologists study how people think, feel, and behave. But environmental psychologists, we think that all of our thoughts, all of our perceptions, all of our behaviors are place-based. They have a context. And so we look at that environmental context. And so we look at how the environment influences how we think, feel, and behave, but also how we influence and affect our environment.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad we've got you on here with your expertise. Obviously, you kindly sent me a copy of your book, Biodiversity and Health in the Face of Climate Change. Well, in the book, you mentioned Kaplan and Kaplan's preference matrix. First of all, can you describe what this is, please?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, we all have preferences, right? Like we prefer one thing over another, and preferences are important psychologically because they influence behavior. Like my preference of an ice cream influences which one I'm going to buy, right? And so there likewise are aspects about the physical environment that we all prefer. One person may prefer living in the city center and hustle and bustle, and someone may prefer being out in the countryside where it's quieter, right? And these preferences will have consequences on behavior, where we buy a house, for example, or how we want to style the inside of our house. And so the Kaplan's preference matrix is a theory on preference that is based on information rather than aesthetic beauty. So the preference matrix is all about the information that an environment provides for us, and that an environment that is easily understood is an environment that'll be preferred by somebody. Just think about the times where you had to immediately understand and get information from an environment. Like you step into a department store for the first time, like a John Lewis, if you're in the UK, and you have to look at the landscape and you have to figure out where am I? And then how do I get to where I want to go? And you have to read that landscape in order to get information from that landscape in order to figure out what you want to do in it. And so this is what the Kaplans are talking about, is that generally those environments where you can easily understand and read it and get information from it are going to be environments in which you prefer.
Okay, so that would explain then why, obviously other listeners will know, and we've discussed it in the past, but the different research that's been done on why we're so happy in nature. I suppose it's an environment where we recognize we don't have to think too much as well, I suppose. So we have a preference for certain types of nature views. Maybe we can sort of talk about that in a minute or discuss that, but obviously you discuss in your book how biodiversity is a key to creating that positive visual stimulus. You know, for example, you talk about having a field of wild flowers that has a biodiverse mix. I mean, can you expand on that a little bit? You know, maybe sort of touch on the research, yeah, and sort of describe the connection between sort of biodiversity and the preference matrix.
Yeah, so the preference matrix isn't just saying that, you know, all nature will be preferred. It's all about the, you know, there are many times that we've all been in a forest and suddenly turned around and just got lost because everything looked the same.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Kaplan's preference matrix, it's all the information that we get from the environment is based on certain aspects, design aspects, if you will. So, you know, is the environment legible? Can I understand how to get from A to B, right? Is it coherent? You know, does it all make sense? Does everything hang together? Can I understand everything that's in this place, or is it just all weird and chaotic? Is it complex? Is there a lot of complexity? Is there a lot of stimuli? Or are there a lot of things going on and I can't understand what's going on? And in the writing by the Kaplans, when they discuss an environment's complexity, they also mention the words like an environment's richness or an environment's diversity. And so aspects of complexity in the preference matrix by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan are touching upon aspects of the diversity within a landscape. So complexity is things like, you know, there's too much to think about, or there's too little going on. So we can think of this with regards to biodiversity. You know, we have a lot of biodiversity. There's an incredible variety of plants and species going on or present in this landscape. Or is it a monoculture? Is it just grass and no life, you know, no bees or wildlife whatsoever, right? So this is like, you know, really complex or really not complex. And just like Goldilocks in the Three Bears, we as humans really prefer an environment with a medium amount of complexity. We don't like an environment that's too complex, that has too much going on, because then it's chaotic and we can't really figure out what's going on. But likewise, an environment that's not very complex, that is just a monoculture, that's just grass, isn't very stimulating and not really interesting enough. So we like and prefer environments that are in this medium complexity.
So that would sort of, because they also talk, I mean, which you discuss, is the meadow of wild flowers. You know, having a sort of mix of flowers and sort of that, I suppose for me as well, it's like the repeated patterns as well. You know, it's this sort of, let's just talk about fractals, I suppose. It's kind of go to that sort of patterns in leaf.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's an experimental study actually manipulated a meadow, and they weren't testing preference, they were testing stress reduction.
Yeah.
But they had a bunch of potted plants. So they have maybe, I don't know, 100 planters, right? And what they did was they varied the species mix of grasses and flowers to mimic a meadow. And they had, in these planters, maybe they had, you know, only one species of grass. And then they changed it and it would be maybe 12 species. And then they had 30 species and 60 species. But they kept the number of planters the same. And what they found when they hooked up blood pressure monitors to people and had people sit in front of these meadows of varying species for 2 minutes, they found that blood pressure reduced the most, aka people were most relaxed, when they looked at the meadows of the 30 different species. So right in the middle, so the 60 species and the monoculture were the most stressful, but the least stressful was looking at 30 different species of plants in a meadow.
So that's back to, like you say, the mean. It's back to that the middle ground type of thing, that sort of moderate visual complexity kind of side of things, which obviously is great from the point of view of biodiversity and sort of the environment, you know, message anyway, isn't it, really, about having like a nice balanced mix of flowers and sort of an ecosystem that is beneficial for us. You know, obviously we think is beneficial for being outside and all that kind of stuff, you know, for people, for the plants and the wildlife, but actually, as it turns out, it's there's actually a health benefit to us, isn't it? Because it brings our blood pressure down, the cortisol levels drop and stuff. So actually, it's a double whammy. So any environmentalists listening, put that in your back pocket. So I do want to just touch just very briefly on, because we're talking about visual complexity. I mean, we're not going to go too much on fractals, but sort of patterns in leaves and sort of forest images with you know, sort of with that lushness and you know, sort of that repeated patterns that you see everywhere in nature. So again, I suppose sort of hypothetical, looking at images that, or you know, that have a sort of balanced mix of that. And also you mentioned as well, if you can see a pathway through, I suppose that's where, because there's lots of arguments about, you know, the best images that you should have on a wall to help promote wellness and all this kind of thing. What's the best biophilic images that you should install in healthcare and education? And people often talk about having a path. I'm looking above your head because I've got a picture on above you that kind of leads off into Africa, but it's yeah, it's sort of pathway, so you can kind of see a way through, I suppose. There's all this, there's sort of that element coming in. Yeah.
In the Kaplan's preference matrix, one aspect that I didn't mention was mystery. It's one of the design aspects that in the Kaplan's preference matrix is mystery. And this isn't us getting immediate information from the environment, which about where I am and where do I want to go. That's legibility. But if I want to explore the environment, if I feel safe in this environment and I want to explore more, then yeah, having an element of mystery where that path, so I can see that path and I understand where that path goes, but it goes around a bend.
Yeah.
You know, it disappears off in the distance, and that facilitates an element of mystery. And I want to explore this space more. I want to follow that path and see where it leads. And it invites me in.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose there's also that it sparks your imagination, doesn't it? So that mystery has that element which has that that sort of element of creativity within us as well. You're finding solutions and things. So I suppose that also gives something for our brain to work on, which rather than, it's like also meditative in a way too, isn't it? Really, you know, rather than just looking at something that tells you what it is, it gives your brain. It's like different artworks as well, isn't it? It has that same kind of stimulus on us that makes us think about things in a different way. I mean, you talk in the book as well about a thing called perceptual fluency, and obviously with reference to specific visual stimuli. But can you explain what perceptual fluency is?
Perceptual fluency is related to fractals. So fractals are the easiest thing to think about it is a fractal is a repeating pattern of various sizes. So it's just the same pattern, but of smaller and smaller sizes. So it's in effect the same shape copied over and over and over again. So common fractals are like waves on the sand of the shore, or the clouds. Snowflakes are a really good example of a fractal. Tree bark, fern leaves, and this is, I wish I had pictures really. A Romanesco broccoli. It's like this broccoli that has a cone and it swirls. So these are all examples of fractals in nature, and they all have the same shape that's just repeated over and over again at different sizes. And perceptional fluency is the ease with which a specific visual stimulus is processed by our brains. And fractals, because they repeat the same pattern, they contain redundant information. So it's just the same image, the same pattern, the same wave, just repeated over and over and over again. And that information, because it's repeated, is really easy for our brains to process. So it doesn't take a lot of effort for our brains to really understand what we're looking at. And that's what perceptual fluency is. It's easy on the eye for our brains to understand.
Okay. So then that would also explain why mandalas, for instance, when you're, the sort of the thing when you're meditating in, you're doing yoga, there's a thing that we look at mandalas, which have the repeated patterns, the sort of repeated geometric forms, and you see people creating these meditative repeated patterns, repeated, like, triangles and circles and triangles and triangles and triangles, and they kind of build up, and then you just, and there's that meditative state where you're, as you just sort of mentioned, that your sort of brain relaxes and you just look at this repeated pattern that you don't have to sort of work out, you don't have to think about. It's but they've obviously proven that that's actually good for us, that's good for bringing us down, if you want, I suppose. Is it kind of, is that what it is? Or?
Yeah, so our brains do so much. They're always thinking, they're always trying to understand what they're looking at, and conceptualize things and make next steps. And that can be cognitively, it can be really, really difficult to focus our attention all the time, to understand what we're looking at, to make sense of it is cognitively task. It's effortful.
Yeah.
And there's a limited ability for us to do this. We've all experienced at the end of a long workday, we're just mentally exhausted. We can't think anymore. And then your kids or your significant other asks you what's for dinner, and you're just like, I can't even, like, there's not, just like, my brain can't even do one more thing at this moment in time. So you're cognitively fatigued. And fractals and repeating patterns in mandalas or in nature are good for our brains, because our brains can then just rest. They don't have to do that heavy lifting. They don't have to do that cognitive effort. It's really easy for them. And that can then enable our brain to work even harder for something else, for another mental task. For example, a study had people do a difficult task. They had to do a math problem. But while doing a math problem, they had to look at a picture that either was a fractal image or just a highly complex, like, non-fractal image. And they found that people did better at answering the math problem when there was the fractal image next to them than when there was this, like, scrambly chaos picture. And that's because the brain didn't have to, work at looking at the fractal image. It didn't need that effort for that. It could focus only on doing the math problem.
Yeah.
But when doing the math problem and having a non-fractal image that was all chaotic, the brain was split. It was like, I need to sort of work out what I'm looking at here, but also pay attention and work out this math problem. And it goes back to this idea of complexity. It's too much complexity going on. Our performance, our ability to complete a math problem, our ability to focus and concentrate is diminished.
Yeah.
As opposed to an environment that has less stimulus.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So obviously I'm interested in sort of biophilic solutions in design, and how we can create interiors, how we can create environments, particularly in healthcare and education and workplaces, where we can perform to our best. We can be our best selves, really. So that's really interesting, because if people are listening and they're looking to, there's people who are doing lots of complex mathematical solutions, or they're doing coding, or where there's lots and lots of, you just need to zone in and concentrate, but you need to have, like, some kind of visual around you, whether that's actually, it'd be interesting to see if it's got the visual, without the visual, if there's, like, if they've done one with the visual, one with a fractal, one with like completely bonkers, and then one with nothing. I don't know if there's been one, but it'd be interesting to see what the three different sides is, one with, like sort of like control study. But that's really interesting about just, having something that, I suppose as well, there's also that element of looking up, isn't there, because you can't look at your paper all the time. You do have to give yourself a bit of time out with your eyes and your brain, isn't it? You just look away or look. So if you've got something that you can just lose yourself in, really, but you recognize, is really interesting. I mean, in as well, I mean, we sort of know about attention restoration theory, but I'd like to hear what you think that is, what it means for you, kind of thing. And also you talk about stress reduction theory in the book too. I mean, again, maybe you could talk about that and how sort of like biophilic views can help, since we're talking about biophilic views in this one today. So
yeah. So moving away from talking about like preference or fractals, because both of those are based in the psychological research on preference. So when we talk about attention restoration theory or stress reduction theory, we're now moving towards understanding the health benefits or the health consequences of interaction with nature or interaction with elements of biodiversity. And attention restoration theory and stress reduction theory are one of the pathways through which biodiversity can influence our human health. So as you mentioned, I published earlier this year a biodiversity health framework. This details the 4 different pathways through which biodiversity can have an impact on our human health. And these are both positive and negative. So it's things like, biodiversity can influence human health by first reducing harm. Biodiversity provides us with medicines, clean air, and water. Biodiversity can also, on the flip side, cause harm, as we know with like COVID-19, zoonotic diseases, allergens. So biodiversity can also influence human health negatively through pathogens and viruses and whatnot. But biodiversity can also influence human health and well-being through the restoring capacities domain. So this is attention restoration theory, stress reduction theory, as well as building up our capacities. So if this is things like how biodiversity can influence human health by encouraging physical activity, facilitating experiences, transcendental experiences like the experience of awe or the opportunity for self-reflection. And so there are these 4 different ways in which biodiversity can influence human health.
Okay, that's actually a really nice way of looking at sort of biophilic enhancements, actually, to have those 4 different elements. It's all the things that we talk about in biophilic design, but I love the fact that it's bringing in this sort of, biodiversity. Can you sort of, from your point of view, how would you define biodiversity?
Yeah, it's it's a really good question. So I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm an environmental psychologist. So I don't reinvent the wheel. I don't define biodiversity, create my own definition. I use the UN's Convention for Biological Diversity's definition, which is the diversity of species, within species, ecosystems, and organisms. So it's the diversity of genes within a certain species, the variety of species, so different types of oak trees, for example, different types of, just think about the different species of dog or types of dog that we have and interact with. So this is what I mean by biodiversity. I don't just mean green space or a tree. It's the type of tree.
Yeah, it's the diversity of life. Life, it's diversity of life, isn't it? Yeah, like we're all one species, but we're all different, aren't we, really? Yeah. And then you think all the birds in the trees, that again, sort of going back to the fact, this sort of this visual stimuli that we have. If we just saw one pigeon, for instance, and just like the same type of pigeon constantly, it's, I mean, just to put it really naively, it's boring, isn't it? It's kind of, whereas if we see, you know, different shapes of birds and sizes and colors and song, different sounds and their activity and their movement and their different flight patterns and the way they eat, this for us is a really amazing stimulus, isn't it? It gives us joy, it makes us happy, it inspires us. You know, I think all these different things. So it's lovely to hear that obviously that sort of there's been actually studies, proper, you know, psychological studies, proper managed studies to prove that having more biodiversity has a beneficial effect on us. And I think we can actually embrace that and bring that into our biophilic design solutions in interiors and also in the urban spaces as well for our public well-being and sort of interaction as well.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier the study with the meadows,
yeah,
where they varied the species mix of the flowers and herbs and looked at blood pressure. So that was testing the stress reduction theory, looking at how biodiversity of plants can influence stress reduction. But then there are, as you say, other studies looking at how biodiversity can impact on attention restoration theory. So specifically, an aspect of attention restoration theory that your listeners may know is in order for an environment to restore our attention, we must first have an experience of 4 different qualities of that environment. You know, that environment needs to be fascinating, as you were just saying about, you know, patterns of birds in flight. So that we have to be fascinated by this environment. And, you know, clearly biodiversity, biodiverse elements, you know, having more species of birds that we can hear and we can see is going to be more fascinating than just one species of bird that we hear. Another element of attention restoration theory is a sense of being away, that we feel like we're getting away from our everyday routine. And research is showing that, you know, biodiversity, you know, does enhance our experience of being away.
Okay, that's great. And what are the other 2?
The other 2 are coherence and extent, compatibility and coherence or extent. So compatibility is just, you know, like with people, you know, does this environment facilitate what I want to do? So think about when you want to study or read something, but you're in a really busy cafe and like the environment is not conducive for what you want to do, or you're trying to have a phone call in a busy cafe, like the environment and you just don't match. And so research has shown that, yeah, that you know, natural environments are usually compatible for what we want to do. If what you want to do is relax, for example, and that, yeah, biodiverse environments facilitate, you know, that compatibility. I want to stay here longer. What I want to do in this environment, you know, are enables what I want to do. And then the last one is coherence. It's just the, you know, that this whole thing like sits together and I can understand the environment really easily and find that a biodiverse environment does facilitate that experience as well.
Okay, so it's like it's a nice holistic way of approaching an environment, isn't it? Really, yeah, I like that. Well, I'm going to have you back, please, to talk about sort of nature and health in an urban setting. I think that's going to be really positive thing. And I am talking to different urban planners and things independently. So it'd be really interesting to get your take on that. And I say there's another paper that you sent me as well, which I'll read. And just for the listeners as well, if people want to go to the journal of biophilicdesign.com, there'll be links to different articles. And if you want to get in touch with Melissa, you can. I'm assuming they can. But if they want to stalk you and academically and yeah, and sort of connect with you and find out more about what you've written, and also I'll put a link to the book as well, so people can grab a copy of that. But before you go, Melissa, I would like to ask the final question, which listeners will know that I always ask everybody, this kind of sort of like crazy magic brush of biophilia. What would the world look like to you if you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia?
So the main issues in society right now, as you mentioned with the book, are, climate change, biodiversity loss, urbanization, and ill health. So, and they're all connected, these issues. And so for me to paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, I would bring nature to people by rewilding our cities, by planting trees on residential streets and creating interconnected green spaces, so that these are nature-based solutions that fight against climate change and biodiversity loss, but also, bring in the added benefits of, birdsong into our residential areas, having food for pollinators, having a nice place where we want to walk around, enabling us to walk for longer because all the spaces are interconnected, and clean air and reduced depression.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.